Is climate change destroying your flood insurance rates? Maybe. Everybody's talking about climate change and talking about how it's destroying everything right now. Are you even gonna be able to live in your house in the next couple of years because of climate change? That's what we're talking about today. So if you're concerned about being able to stay in your house because of cost, this video is for you as a homeowner or a real estate investor. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru, and more than 12 years ago, I bought a house in a flood zone just like this and was told premiums were gonna be $3,000 when they should have been $300. And I've been helping homeowners and real estate investors just like yourself the last 12 years with these issues. So today we're talking about climate change. Everybody keeps talking about climate change. It's, ending the world. It's destroying everything, especially flood insurance rates. So let's talk a little bit about this today. And the fact is that climate change may not be having as big of an impact as other things. And we're gonna talk about that later in this video. Before we go any further, make sure we can change the world by letting you subscribe, like, and share the channel so other people can find the same valuable content. Now we're talking about climate change here. We've been having climate change since the days of the dinosaurs. Climate has always changed. People talk about global warming. But global warming, whether you agree with it or you don't, it's simply a form of climate change. The climate's always changing and it always will be. But it seems that lately people are maybe blaming more on climate change. Look, things in the climate that are changing didn't just happen overnight. It's compounded over time. One of the leading factors of climate change issues though, guess what? Human behavior when it comes to climate change. One of the big things with climate change is we have weather patterns that are changing, all these things, is human behavior is actually multiplying really the impact climate change is having specifically on flood insurance rates. So let's look at land development. Let's just talk about human behavior. We're talking about greed here and the way a lot of this land is being developed. You see this neighborhood I'm in? This was all clear space 6 months ago. Now there's a house on every corner. Guess what happens when you developed all that land? You've got areas that were in low risk flood zones now go to high risk. It may take a flood map 5 to 10 years to catch up. Now you've got people that are in a high risk flood area that are not aware of it because their banks are not requiring it because the flood map has not been updated yet. So land development can do a lot to go with climate change when it comes to flood insurance costs. Because what happens is when you don't develop this land, you have a saturation rate into the soil of about 90%. When you develop this land and you add all this asphalt like I'm standing on right here, guess what? That 90% now goes to 10%. That water's got to go somewhere. And a lot of times that may mean that water settling in your house. It might mean water running off from your neighbor's house into your house because of that land development. So land development with climate change can have a big impact on flood insurance availability, flood insurance rates. It's one of the reasons why the National Flood Insurance Program with their risk rating 2.0 looks at things like distance to water. Guess what? When we develop land, houses get much closer to the water because people either want to live on the water or they want a beautiful view or things like that. Then you've got flooding frequency. Well, guess what? Flooding frequency increases when we develop land that maybe should not have necessarily been developed, or we're looking at loopholes to get around building codes and things like that. These are all things that can increase flooding frequency, which is why the National Flood Insurance Program now looks at that. As we're also developing land in these areas, maybe it's areas that are in rural areas. So the replacement cost of a lot of these properties is 60% higher than it was 2 years ago. Guess what? That can also drive up flood insurance rates because the National Flood Insurance Program looks at these. So do private companies when we look at climate change. Now we're talking about type of flooding. Type of flooding is increasing a lot when it comes to flash flooding across the country. Let's look at the last 5 years, for example. Let's look at Birmingham, Alabama, a few years ago in October, which was its driest month of the year. Traditionally, they get 12 inches of rain in about 6 hours. You had to do 82 home rescues in parts of Birmingham, Alabama. You had I-65, which is the interstate, and Highway 31, basically turn into rushing rivers where people had water in their properties that have never had it, all from an afternoon thunderstorm that came through and dumped a bunch of rain there. Same thing for St. Louis, Missouri, who had about 13 inches of rain in 4 hours a couple years ago. In the morning time, Waverly, Tennessee, 17 inches of rain in 24 hours. It's crazy. Dallas, Texas, 10 inches of rain in about 6 hours. An area that doesn't typically get a lot of rainfall, but did at that time. And it's happened a couple times. Houston, Texas could be a great example as well, as they continue to have problems. It's why Houston has their own flood risk score. You see, there's more stories like this across the country where flooding is changing, flood frequency is changing, weather patterns are changing, stronger thunderstorms, stronger hurricanes. Look what Hurricane Ian did in Florida. Compare Ian back to Harvey and Katrina, and these hurricanes are just getting stronger and stronger, which are having a big impact on flood insurance insurance rates across the country. In fact, especially in Florida, historically, you've had a lot of insurance companies move out because they didn't want the exposure. So you see, all these different things are having a big impact. So you're watching this video and you're really concerned about climate change impacting your flood insurance, impacting your wallet. Well, what can you do about it as a homeowner or property owner? Well, one thing is, especially with your property, is advocating on that land development, making sure certain areas are protected. It's also understanding your flood risk score, and you can find that in the description of this video. Understanding, hey, what are the actual chances of my property flooding over a 30-year period that looks at climate change? 0 to 100, closer to 100, the higher your flood risk score. Guess what? The higher your flood risk score is, typically the higher your flood insurance premiums could be. So this could help you as a potential homeowner understand what's going to happen with that property over a long time frame when it comes to climate change, flood insurance costs, and things like that. It also looks at other things that are not climate change, but understanding that flood risk score is one step. Next step is managing water around your property. You know, if you live in the north, for example, if you're in Minnesota, Wisconsin, snow melt season is a big spring runoff season. Now, this is an area where a lot of people have problems. So creating a buffer between the foundation of your house and where that snowpack is, if you can go a long way in avoiding seepage in your basement in that area. If you live in the south, redirecting water off your roof with the gutters away from the house where water's not coming into your basement as a result of this from all these storms. You know, making sure you've got debris cleared out on gutters and all these things where that water's not backing up in your house from these severe storms. So these are also things you can do. So when it comes to your rates though, what can you do? Well, remember, you always want to look at the National Flood Insurance Program as an option, which is through the federal government. Then you also want to look at private flood insurance. But here's the thing, you want to look at least 3 different private flood insurance options because they all look at risk differently. You know, some may be moving out of an area that are no longer going to insure it, and some aren't. So if someone tells you that flood insurance is not available in your area through a private company, then you may want to go down the street and ask if someone else has got more options, because typically this is not the case. It's just maybe certain private companies. So these are what you can do as a homeowner. Then it's understanding the replacement cost on your property. You know, the higher the replacement cost, the higher an impact could be on your flood insurance costs. So understanding that. So these are some ways to get a good understanding of how climate change is impacting your flood insurance, or more importantly, how other things are actually impacting it just as much as climate change, like human behavior, land development, water runoff, stormwater management, all these things, which is why the National Flood Insurance Program is so big on floodplain management guidelines of not letting people build in certain areas or do certain things when it comes to the base flood elevation. Remember, base flood elevation is the level FEMA thinks flooding could come to in your area. You always want to make sure if you're building a house, you can build it a couple feet above that, because it's very common for these maps to change. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video on climate change impact on your flood insurance. I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. But before you move on to our next video, make sure to hit subscribe to this channel so you can get up-to-date information, share, like. You can visit our Flood Learning Center below as well if you've got further questions. We look forward to talking to you in the next video. Thank you.